Good night and welcome to Queer Town Hall. I'm Nancy Hawk, the Executive Director of Basic Rights Oregon, and I'm very, I won't say excited. I'm honestly a little anxious. Tonight we are going to Good night and welcome to Queer Town Hall. I know I'm Nancy Hawk, the executive for a lot of folks, and so I'm going to encourage everybody to take care of themselves and also say that, you know, for the past 8 weeks, we've been discussing topics every week that affect the LGBTQ community, and tonight is no exception. And we'll be talking about suicide prevention, and this is not meant to be a therapeutic session. So tonight's broadcast will include content about suicide and other experiences that might feel a little traumatizing to you or a lot traumatizing to you. So you might experience strong or overwhelming feelings as a result. And if you find yourself in distress or in crisis, we encourage you to seek support that works for you. We're going to have a list of resources in our chat box that might be helpful to you, and we'll keep those throughout the broadcast. And a lot of people find it helpful to talk to a friend or family member or someone else they trust, and that tonight's broadcast, while we'll be discussing mental health, cannot provide therapy. But what we will do is let you know about resources for suicide prevention in our community. And it's a really important topic. I think that it's not one that I really talked about a lot publicly before 2017, when we at Basic Rights Oregon lost a really important member of our community. And then in 2019, in her honor, we passed Addie's Act, which was a bill that requires every school district in Oregon to have a policy around suicide prevention and suicide postvention. And it was a really important, really felt like a very personal bill that we got passed. And so for the past few years, I think we've been talking about it more. And tonight we have an incredible group of panelists who are both in our state and national, who are going to share some great resources. And so, as usual, I'm going to let people introduce themselves. Please share your name, your pronouns, where you work, a little bit about your organization, and just one good or positive thing that you've learned from being home so much during this pandemic. And I will start, I always go alphabetically, so I'm going to start with you, Annette.
Thank you, Nancy. So my name is Annette Marcus, and I use she and her pronouns. And I work with the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide, which is part of the Association of Oregon Community Mental Health Programs. And what the Alliance does is we bring people together from across the state to think about how we can have better policy and practice across the state to prevent suicide. And we specifically work a lot with the Oregon Health Authority and advise them. I think one of the best things about this staying at home time has been a little bit of quieting of my soul. Like just kind of the frantic busyness of commuting. I did a long commute every day, and I was always listening to an audiobook, etc. And now instead of commuting, I sit in my back porch and commune a bit with the birds.
That sounds lovely. But listen, crows, no loud cawing during this broadcast. I'm sitting by my window. Next, Christian, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Nancy and Dominic and Ida and others at Basic Rights Oregon for inviting me to join this wonderful panel and important discussion. My name is Christian Burgess. I use the pronouns he, him, his, and I'm director of the Disaster Distress Helpline, which is a part of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, both of which are funded by the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, and administered by my parent company, the not-for-profit Vibrant Emotional Health, which is based in New York City. I actually work remotely for Vibrant and have for many years now here in Oregon. And although the programs are national in scope, and I'll hopefully get a chance to talk a little bit more about those later in the forum. And because I know that was a lot that I just put out there about all the different levels of these programs. And one positive thing that I've learned about myself, and I've seen this in sort of a lot of the coping strategies that have gone around during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this one resonates particularly for me, which is to be really forgiving of your emotions during this time, that pretty much whatever reactions you have are valid. And so I've just learned to sincerely appreciate that, because I've had days, clearly my work level is really stressful right now, and I've had days where I've just wanted to watch TV after work for 5 hours, and the dishes go unwashed and the laundry goes undone. And then I've had days where I've, felt more productive. And so I'm just sort of accepting that and being really forgiving of what I need to do in that particular day to cope.
Thank you for that, Christian, and I think that's an important lesson for all of us that I know I've kept learning during the past few months. Dior, our guest from the East Coast, who's coming in later at night to be part of this, so thank you, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Dior Vargas, and I'm a Latina feminist mental health activist. I'm also a suicide attempt survivor. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm in New York City. I guess for me, I've just realized that I can easily adjust to a lot of different situations, positive or negative, and so, I don't know, maybe that's a New Yorker in me, but just got to keep going.
Yeah, that's a great lesson. Parker, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Nancy. My name is Parker Sczepanik, and I am our YouthLine outreach strategist statewide. I work primarily with YouthLine, which is a service of Lines for Life. YouthLine itself is a peer-to-peer crisis support and helpline, and then Lines for Life is our mother organization that take suicide prevention calls, and a military line and a veterans crisis line and senior loneliness line. So a lot of really great resources for people nationwide. I use she, her pronouns, and I think the best thing I've learned about myself is pretty similar to what Christian was saying, and I'm giving myself a little more compassion and grace, knowing that if I am not doing the best job that I think I could be doing, it's probably because my body is in crisis. So it's been nice to just give myself a little bit of breathing room and know that it will get done, and it's okay to take a break if I need to.
That's great. Thank you. And I don't see that, and we're going to have actual volunteer for the YouthLine join us shortly. It seems like we might need still a few minutes for her to join us. So why don't we go ahead? Oh, let me share mine. Oh, she is here. Okay. Sivia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Sivia Cheng, and I use pronouns she, her, and I am an actual YouthLine volunteer, and I've been on YouthLine for over a year now. And one of the things I've learned during quarantine, I guess, is like how to actually be content with like myself and not having to interact with everyone all the time.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it's one I think I'm learning all the time, again and again. And I feel like, and I'm not sure if I've shared this because I've had to answer this question for 8 weeks, but I do feel like I've, I don't know if it's age or the quarantine or whatever, but I feel like I've really learned gratitude in a way that I haven't actually felt in my body before. And I think I can really feel it now in a way where I think it's so easy to know or feel like we just like what feels hard or what we're not doing rather than gratitude for what we have and what we're capable of. And so just really sort of feeling that in this moment. So because we have this amazing group of panelists, I want to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to go back to a little bit alphabetical order and have Annette start because we are talking a lot today about Oregon. And so if you could just give a little bit of overview of what suicide prevention looks like throughout the state of Oregon and how can people get involved. And before you answer, I just want to remind folks that the way to ask questions is to type them into the YouTube comments, and we will get to all of those questions. Thank you. Oh, also, sorry, Annette, if you ask a question, you'll be entered into a raffle to win our Protect Trans Kids tote bag. Okay, Annette, it's all you now.
I'm on, okay. Great. Well, there is actually a lot of work happening across Oregon around suicide prevention. And sometimes it gets a little bit disconnected. So one of the things my organization is trying to do is really help connect all of those efforts together with really some shared messages around hope, help, and healing. Depending on where you live in the state, there's about 15 different coalitions, suicide prevention coalitions. Some of them are at a county level, some are regional, that you can get engaged with. Every county has somebody who is designated as a suicide prevention coordinator. Sometimes they're out of public health, sometimes they're out of your local community mental health program. We also have, the crisis text line, there's Lines for Life, there's a variety of kind of helplines to call into for immediate help. But then some of the other suicide prevention work that's happening is really happening through schools, through community groups. So for example, there's something called Sources of Strength that is in many of the schools around Oregon and is expanding. And that's a peer-led program in schools to promote messages of hope, help, and healing, or hope, help, and strength. And so one of the things I would say about the suicide prevention field in Oregon is that some of the things have the word suicide in them, but remember, suicide prevention is really about building community and connection and breaking isolation. And so some of the work that I think of as really serious suicide prevention work may not have the word suicide in the title. Mm-hmm. I guess just one other comment about that is that something really amazing happened last year at the state legislature, which is that $6 million was allocated directly for suicide prevention in the state. And as Nancy mentioned, Senate Bill 52, Addie's Act, was passed. And it's a level of commitment that Oregon's never had before. Now, it's really important for Oregon to have that because we do have a high suicide rate in our state. And there's a lot of indications that it is higher amongst our LGBTQ community. And so we really need to invest in promoting resiliency, promoting protective factors, and showing up for people in the right ways when they need us to show up.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think showing up for people and figuring out how best to do that is a lot of what tonight's about, because I think that resource is so important. And so I wonder, just thinking about, communities that are sort of most affected by, I think all communities are affected by suicide, but I think we often don't hear about the high numbers in the LGBTQ community and around and among people of color. I wonder, Dior, if you can tell us a little bit about the People of Color Mental Illness Photo Project and why you created it.
Sure. So I started the People of Color and Mental Illness Photo Project in 2014. I had recently started my mental health advocacy around that time. And while I was doing research, trying to see what organizations were having these conversations and what were the conversations in general, I noticed that when I entered terms like mental health or depression or anxiety, what came up in Google Images were a lot of white people, and they didn't represent people that looked like me, looked like my friends, my family, or my community in general. So I decided that I would create a photo project where people of color could submit photos of themselves holding signs, basically talking about their experience as a person of color, experiencing their mental health, how the stigma impacts them differently, and how their access to care is pretty difficult. So it was a really great opportunity to create a community and see how many people in so many different ways have been impacted by it. And it's been wonderful. I also self-published and then had self-published a book of the photo project, and then an independent publisher published another version, but in both English and in Spanish. So I'm extremely happy about the work that I've been doing, and it's really about representation, people seeing people who look like them. When I was growing up, I never saw anyone who looked like me who was going through what I was going through, experiencing multiple suicide attempts. So I want to create that space where people feel like they're not alone, even more so when it comes to the media. And it's just really important that there are more people of color in suicide prevention, not only those who are experiencing it, but also clinical-wise.
Thank you for that. And I just want to share that when I was getting ready for tonight's town hall and I looked up your photo project, it was so meaningful to me. Having had a close family member who really suffered with mental illness, and then just, there not being resources at all for her. And, the idea of her being in talk therapy and not her first or second, but her fifth language, English, was just felt impossible to access. And so, I just want to really appreciate your project and what it means for me personally. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And also just wanting to think about some of those resources we do have based here in Oregon. And Parker, can you just tell us a little bit about YouthLine and how people can connect to it?
Happily. So YouthLine, again, is a peer-to-peer or teen-to-teen crisis support and helpline. What that means is that teens all throughout the nation, not just Oregon, can reach out to us via text, chat, or call, and they're able to talk to another teen who's been trained to provide that crisis intervention and support. All of our teens have gone through about 63 hours, and they get certified in youth mental health first aid and safe talk. After about 6 months, they'll get invited to do applied suicide intervention skills training, which is ASSIST, and it's pretty much the gold standard. And so they're really well trained and informed to be able to provide that service. But the big piece is that they're providing the peer-to-peer connection in and of itself. So it's not just the training; it's also the relatability and the understanding that comes from being a youth and being a peer in today's day and age. Sivia is one of our YouthLine volunteers, and is an incredible peer support and an advocate for people her age. But nationwide, we have people calling in about lots of different things. And it's really important to know that with YouthLine, there's no crisis too big or too small to reach out to us about. So yes, it can be something as high acuity as suicidal ideation or a plan or means or an attempt that's, something that they're thinking about. But it can also look like I'm having a hard time with my homework and I'm feeling really stressed, or I just got broken up with. So knowing that crisis is big and small can help normalize the conversation around what crisis looks like, and also normalize help-seeking behavior. So really getting people to reach out for help and reach out for that support because they deserve it. So YouthLine does a lot of different things, but the main goal is providing crisis intervention support and help to young people throughout the nation.
Thanks. And Sivia, you already got a shout out from Parker. And when I was touring Lines for Life, I was really impressed by YouthLine. Can you tell me what it's like to be a volunteer? What's an average day of a volunteer at YouthLine look like?
Well, it's really an amazing experience because you're answering the calls and chats and text systems as soon as you walk in. But even after all the training that we have to receive before we step into the room, the learning doesn't really end there. And every day I'm learning more from my volunteers and my supervisors from about how to react and interact with these people and how to really make connections with them and help them feel better, I guess. And like there's such an overwhelming support just in the call center itself. So like it becomes a really nice community, and it's like, it kind of makes it fun, I guess. Yeah.
That's great. It feels so important, and it's like such an incredible thing that you get to do. And we also have another helpline with us tonight. Christian, can you tell us a little bit about the Disaster Distress Helpline and the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline?
Sure. So the Disaster Distress Helpline, we launched in 2012, and we're the only crisis hotline that's national in scope and dedicated to providing 24/7 crisis counseling and emotional support to anyone in the United States struggling with distress or other mental health concerns related to any natural or human-caused disaster, and that includes public health emergencies such as what we're experiencing right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our calls, we have two core services, 24/7 hotline, which is 1-800-985-5990. We also have a text option where people can text the keyword "talk with us." That's TALKWITHUS all together to the short code 66746. And like what we're hearing from Lines for Life and the Teen Crisis Line, these calls and texts are answered by trained counselors from a network of independently operated crisis centers located across the country. So as I mentioned in my introduction, the DDH and the Lifeline are funded by SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, which is a federal agency and a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, administered by my parent company, Vibrant Emotional Health. So what that means is that basically when people call these services, and the Lifeline has a separate number, even though we're in the same family of services, the Lifeline has a separate number hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. The Lifeline also has a chat option, which people can access through suicidepreventionlifeline.org. So when people call or text or chat with these services, they're answered by an independently operated crisis center. So the Lifeline and the DDH, we're not this one center that's somewhere in the United States where people call and all that one center answers all these calls. We're actually comprised of all these centers located across the country. The Lifeline has over 170 crisis centers across the country in its network, including Lines for Life, which covers the Lifeline for Oregon. We also, I believe we have a newer crisis center in our network in Salem, and apologies for not having that information right in front of me, but and that's pretty much how the Lifeline model works, that when people call the Lifeline, they're meant to be routed to their nearest crisis center, because the typical caller or chat or what have you to the Lifeline, there's a higher risk that person might be experiencing some kind of acute mental health crisis, so there's an advantage to connecting them with a crisis center that's in or close to their community. The Disaster Distress Helpline, we actually have a national routing model where when people call us, they're routed to the next available center in our network. And the reason why we have a different routing for the for the DDH is because in times of disaster, the DDH, we typically see a major spike in calls right when that disaster occurs, whether it's a hurricane or a wildfire or an earthquake, a tornado, incident of mass violence like a mass shooting. Our calls spike significantly in the immediate aftermath. And so we can't have any one center answer all those calls if it's happening in obviously a local area somewhere. And so our calls are distributed evenly among these three call centers so that no one center gets overwhelmed with the volume. It's sort of how disaster preparedness and response works in general with surge capacity in times of disaster. And so that's the disaster. Again, the main point of the Disaster Distress Helpline is really to provide emotional support to survivors and responders and anyone struggling related to disasters. So we sort of have a different routing system, different operations, and a different target audience than the Lifeline does, whereas the Lifeline focuses more on people who are experiencing any kind of mental health or crisis.
Thank you. It's good to know that all those resources are out there for folks. So you mentioned something, which is COVID, that I think we're all experiencing, and just wondering how it's affecting people's work. And wondering, do you want to take that, Parker? And then Christian, I'll let you jump in.
Sure.
Sure, sounds good. As an essential service, YouthLine and Lines for Life are still open. We're still taking calls and contacts, and we're still providing support and intervention. As far as YouthLine goes, we still actually have youth coming into the office, to the call center to provide that service. We're following all the CDC guidelines, and we are sanitizing everything until our hands are so dry and all of that good stuff. And our youth all wear masks. We have a limited capacity at 10 people in the room at any given time. So it's about 8 YouthLine volunteers and then our 2 master's level clinicians who monitor and supervise all the calls. We have seen a pretty big increase in contacts in general, but YouthLine has been growing pretty exponentially over the last few years anyways. But if we look at data from March of 2019 to March of 2020, there has been about a 35% increase in the amount of contacts we're getting. Acuity, however, has remained pretty much the same as it always has. Some people are calling about relationship issues. Some people are calling about suicidal ideation. And we don't want to jump the gun and say that everybody's struggling with more suicidal thoughts because of COVID, or everyone's mental health is struggling more because of COVID, because the data isn't going to prove that to us because it's only been so much time. But we do have quite a few people talking about COVID. A lot of YouthLine contacts are talking pretty openly about feeling like they're stuck and feeling like their mental health is struggling more because of the crisis. And I know that with our LGBTQ plus community, a lot of that queer community are reaching out because of family and friend issues, mental health concerns, and suicidal ideation. I think about 13% of youth from January 2020 to now have actually, mentioned COVID and identified themselves as someone in the queer community. So keeping in mind that 13% can feel pretty heavy, but also knowing that that isn't a full representation of the LGBTQ plus community, because there might actually be people who are struggling that aren't mentioning being part of that community. And so we have seen, some some ebbs and flows in the way that we are getting contacts. But that really hasn't been a dramatic increase overall. We're having the same amount of acuity, and we're providing the same level of crisis intervention support for those people.
Great, thanks for that. And then Parker, did you want to? Sorry, you are Parker. Christian, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen happening with the?
Yeah, sure. So the Disaster Distress Helpline, we're kind of an economy of scale service in that our volume trends almost look like an EKG pattern. So on the national level, in between major disaster events, the ones that make the headlines, our volume tends to go down. But then when a major disaster happens, it spikes up and then starts to eventually go down again until the next major disaster. With COVID-19, our call volume increased by about 400% from one month to the next, so from February to March, when the pandemic started escalating. And then, and compared to the same time period a year prior, our volume was up by about 900%. So clearly this is impacting a lot of people's emotional health around the country. And our volume has stayed steady. It's actually starting to go down a little bit, which is actually pretty consistent with what we've seen with past disasters. As more communities enter into a phase of recovery, for the Disaster Distress Helpline, we're not seeing as many callers and texters experiencing that immediate distress reaction. In those early days, we were getting a lot of calls from people who they were distressed because they wanted information. They needed to know what the pandemic was, what the risk factors were, what resources were available in their community, etc. And now that a lot of people are, and I say that we're entering recovery, but of course a lot of communities are still very much, some communities are experiencing rises in infection rates and the rates of diagnoses, whereas others, those rates are going down. And so it's really mixed around the country. But in the recovery phase, typically for us with the Disaster Distress Helpline, our volume starts to go down, but we start to get more calls where people are starting to grapple with their losses. And the emotions are really coming to the surface. And this could be weeks or months or even years after the initial impact of a disaster when that starts to happen for people. And so for the Disaster Distress Helpline, we are seeing the volume starts to go down, but more people are talking about feelings of depression or feelings of anxiety, other behavioral health concerns like substance misuse, where the reality of the pandemic is really starting to settle in terms of the losses they've experienced as a result of it. And I will say with the Lifeline too, that what Parker said definitely corresponds with what we're seeing at the national level with the Lifeline, that the Lifeline volume did not go up significantly in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. But we heard from crisis centers that more people on the Lifeline were talking about COVID-19 related to whatever other mental health or behavioral health issue they might have been experiencing. But it wasn't the primary reason they were calling necessarily. We're starting to see the trend, reverse trend a little bit though, whereas the Disaster Distress Helpline, our calls are starting to go down a little bit. The Lifeline calls are starting to go up a little bit. And again, that's pretty consistent with what we've seen with other disasters where, again, people's distress reactions or mental health issues might be surfacing now that we're a few months after the initial escalation of the pandemic. And we think that that trend might continue in the months ahead, that the Lifeline might start to see an increase in volume looking forward.
Great. Not great, but thank you for answering the question.
Yeah.
I know it's, you all do such hard work. Dealing with people.
And I'll throw in there, the heart of the Lifeline and the Disaster Distress Helpline is folks like Parker and Sivia. They are frontline workers. And we're getting a lot of calls from people who are in healthcare or any kind of what I don't like to say essential workers, because I feel like everybody is an essential worker, whether you work in a hair salon or whether you work in a store that might have been shuttered because it was quote unquote deemed non-essential. We're all essential. Every service that we provide, no matter what it is essential in some way. But frontline, in terms of that, crisis counselors are frontline workers. And so, and I'll just say one more thing about that too, which is that resources like the Lifeline, the Disaster Distress Helpline, the Teen Line, Lines for Life, we're there for people for self-care as well. And wellness and self-care has been something that has been at the forefront of the work that we're doing with our network of crisis centers around the country. And of course, that's essential right now as well.
Thank you. And I want to ask Dior if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what you see happening with COVID-19 and the communities that you work with.
There you go. I was trying to locate the unmute button. It's very difficult being in New York City and how it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. Personally for me, 3 of my family members got it and were hospitalized, and it was really touch and go. It was terrifying. So it's a lot to handle at the moment. A lot of students who are in public schools, they are now at home. They may not be in the best place right now. Let's say if they're LGBTQ and don't have supportive family, a lot of them don't have access to internet or Wi-Fi or any type of electronic devices to do their work. So people are impacted in so many ways. I am very happy that we do have food banks and they're giving free meals to people. So it is difficult, and we're really thankful to have the doctors and the nurses and all those people who are really sacrificing their lives to help everyone in the city. So it can be very self-isolating to a lot of people, and just thinking about how that impacts the LGBTQ plus community, I think it's really important for them to not blame themselves for what they're going through or how their family feels about them, trying to create spaces within the larger space and making it more of their own. So kind of having that short-term exit strategy and then also thinking about a long-term one. Also establishing boundaries and then not engaging with family members who might antagonize you or make you feel uncomfortable. So there are a lot of different things that youth that are LGBTQ can do to go through this time. But I'm also very, very thankful for the work that the rest of the panelists do in terms of being a support system for them. So it was a long-winded answer to saying, we're going to just keep pushing through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm sorry to hear so many people in your family were directly affected. I know the numbers in New York are terrifying, honestly. Just, it's a lot to go through. So we actually have a significant number of questions from viewers. So I wanted to start with those. And I'll start with sort of a broad question, and maybe I will send it to Annette first. But are there resources that the panelists would suggest for talking about suicide prevention in person-first, empathetic ways?
Yeah. I think one of the big things about talking about suicide with people, for one thing, is to get comfortable with using the word suicide. The word suicide's not a secret, and it's actually not unusual for people to think about suicide. Many of us have experienced feelings of hopelessness, etc. So there's one piece of that that's really normalizing that. I also think paying attention when people are making jokes about, oh, I just want to kill myself, or I just want to end it, or, FML, or whatever. Just kind of checking in and being willing to ask, is that serious? Are you really thinking about killing yourself? So that's some of the direct interaction with people. Sort of the second part of your question, Nancy, had to do with the person-first language. And I guess one thing I want to say about this is, so I come at this as somebody who, this is my field, but I also am a person who has helped navigate a lot with a lot of my friends who are really feeling suicidal, who has had those feelings myself. And so being able to talk with each other in an authentic way, I think, is the most important part of that answer. People can feel your empathy and authenticity, but there are a few phrases that in our field we're really trying to move away from. One of them is the phrase committed suicide, because a lot of people who have lost family members to suicide or have survived suicide attempts themselves talk about the word committed. You talk about somebody committing a sin, committing a crime. It also sounds like there's this level of volition that people don't necessarily feel. So language that we are using more often now is somebody has taken their life, has died by suicide, has killed themselves. Just we also try and avoid language like successfully suicided, because we don't see suicide ever as being a successful outcome. So those are a couple of tips there. And I think the other piece around language is, like with anything, you want to listen to how people are talking about their own experience and honor them for that. So this is not the moment to come in. Somebody's sharing with you about having lost somebody in the family and they say they've committed suicide. That's probably not the moment I would jump in and do a little education around the language to use around suicide, because that's not what they need.
really fair. Yeah. But yeah, I think that it is important. And part of tonight is actually really having this conversation and not feeling like we can't talk about suicide. And I think that, this question really comes from a place of, often in suicide, when we talk about suicide, we talk about statistics. And, there's a person behind every statistic. And so I do think it's really important. And then a question for the people who work in with the crisis lines. Are there any lines that are anonymous or without mandatory reporting rules? I know most lines are confidential, but are any anonymous? And I'm just going to let someone jump in here.
So for YouthLine specifically, we are confidential and anonymous to a point, obviously. So when you mention mandatory reporting, all of our supervisors and our YouthLine volunteers are mandatory reporters. The only time we're going to break that confidentiality is if there's a subpoena for that record, or if somebody is mentioning that they are going to hurt or kill themselves, or potentially hurt or kill another human being, or if there is abuse happening in the home. So unfortunately, we're not, unfortunately, we are not a completely anonymous line, but we work really closely with all of the youth who reach out to us to help them gain some control if we do have to report, or if we do have to call EMS for a wellness check. So we're letting them know that we're mandatory reporters. We're walking them through that process. We're letting them know that the report has been made, and we can also give them an update if they told us if it was a closed or an open case. I personally don't know of any crisis lines that are completely confidential, and so Christian might be able to help us out there.
Mm-hmm. Want to jump in, Christian?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And like Parker said, I don't know of any either that advertise themselves as guaranteeing anonymity or confidentiality in the sense of a last resort option of breaking confidentiality via a third party like emergency response or mobile crisis response. I do know for the Lifeline that occurs in, and I believe less than 1% of all of our calls. And we receive up to 2 million calls per year. It's a very small number of calls where that confidentiality has to be broken because, and that's usually when there is an imminent threat, when the counselor has determined that there may be a suicide in progress, or that for whatever reason the person is a threat to themselves or others. I do know for the Disaster Distress Helpline Lifeline, we don't ask for identifying information. The caller or texter, whomever it may be, may offer that information, but we don't ask for it, like as a protocol, as a rule. But I do think it's a really valid question, because that is, I'm sure, what prevents a lot of people from reaching out to crisis lines, is that fear that a parent or a caregiver or emergency personnel themselves, a lot of people have fear and distrust of emergency personnel. And so if they feel like no matter what they say, 911 is going to be called, that can be re-traumatizing to somebody to experience that. And that's talked about a lot in terms of practices within the suicide prevention community, the involvement of emergency personnel, and more and more counselors and centers and experts are really behind this effort to look at the best option for the person, and not involving emergency personnel unless it is absolutely necessary, and really talking about what does that mean, absolutely necessary, because we don't want to re-traumatize someone who's going through suicidality. So I can't offer up any specific resources that would say that they're completely anonymous. I have heard that there are some services out there. I've heard of services that will talk to someone because they want a voice as they're attempting suicide. They want someone there with them. But I don't know specifically what those services are, and it's not something that the Lifeline or the Disaster Distress Helpline that we promote either. for the reasons that I've mentioned.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I do think it is a fair question. And Christian, you brought up something that I think is really important, which is around emergency services and in particular the police. And, you know, in this moment in 2020, we're really, our country has a big racism problem, which is killing in particular black men, right? And I feel like, you know, even what just happened yesterday in Minnesota and then what happened in Central Park, and we have these really huge examples right now of why so many people feel unsafe calling the police. Dior, would you mind talking a little bit about how you've seen communities navigate that issue with feeling, you know, scared to interact with emergency services and in particular the police?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that what is supposed to help people actually harms them and eventually kills them. So it is in particular very scary. And yeah, speaking of George Floyd and what happened in Central Park, it does make people wary of being in open spaces where, and this goes past the whole police thing, but also people just not wearing masks in public, just the complete disregard for other people's safety. And unfortunately, it's a certain group of people who do that. And so that can be another form of violence that people experience. So it is very overwhelming to be in those spaces. And I think that people do avoid getting access to help because of fear of having to deal with police. And there have been a lot of times where people who are going through psychological distress are killed because the police don't understand what they're going through. And I am aware that there are trainings for police officers, but I think it's a complete, there has to be a sea change in terms of how people even think about number one, communities of color, the LGBTQ plus community, and those who live with mental health conditions. So it's really about changing one's frame of mind and not having it be something where they have training, even thinking about cultural sensitivity, cultural compassionate individuals. It's not just a training that you can take and then it's over. It's something that should be ongoing. So I think people are just trying to take it as it is and trying to live their lives while also being respectful of others at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move on to some more of the questions that have come in. There was a question about older LGBTQ folks. So I know we have two guests from the YouthLine tonight, but people were wondering what the resources are for people over 65, especially LGBTQ people who are over 65. And if, Annette, do you have some resources to share?
Yeah, I guess two things. One, I just wanted to reflect back for a minute on what we were just talking about, and say that that often that across Oregon, there's many places where the police are not the first people that would be coming to the door. So, for example, in Lane County, I don't know Multnomah County as well, but in Lane County, there's a great mental health response crew that does that, and every county actually has a county crisis team that is better trained to come out and respond. This is not me minimizing the fact that law enforcement does get involved sometimes in a crisis situation, but I just kind of want to reassure people that very often that's not the first response. The first response is really bringing in people with some training and who can talk with you about options. Then in terms of the LGBTQ elders community, one of the things I think that we need to acknowledge in our own community is how much we're a strength for each other. And so we have these official ways that we can get support, but I also think we need to lean in to each other too. I know that I have people in my life who are alive today because we developed our own network of support for one another and our own safety planning approaches. And especially for people who've had bad interactions with the medical system, with the police, etc., really need to look to their circle of support. Now, I know that's hard if you're living someplace where you feel like, oh, I'm the only person who's LGBTQ in my community, or I'm living in a nursing home and it's not even a safe place to be out, etc. And I don't have a magic answer around that. I really wish I did, because I hate it that we have people living in places that aren't affirming of who they are and who we are. But a couple of thoughts about that. One is, I know that people have really liked the chat lines. In fact, something like 40-something% of the chats that come in have been folks who've identified as LGBTQ, because I think that has felt like a safer, more anonymous way to connect. There's also a senior hotline that is run out of Oregon, out of Clackamas County, I believe, and one of you should throw in the information if I'm not getting it correctly, but that is a place, it's not LGBTQ specific, but they've also got really good kind of training for listening. I also, like, as somebody who's towards more, I'm not in my 60s yet, but I'm almost there. I have really spent some time developing safety plans with some of my friends, not necessarily around suicide, although you could do it around suicide, but around just how freaked out, lonely, isolated, crappy we're feeling sometimes in the current situation. And we have some agreements about what we do to support each other and regular check-ins with each other, etc. And I really want to encourage us to lean in where we can to do that. And if you don't have a way to do that, to maybe reach out to one of the helplines to get some help in thinking about how some of that might be something you could create in your world.
Thanks for that, Annette. And then we have, and I think that in the resources that we're going to put out, there should be information for, I think Sage has a hotline that folks can access, which is specifically for LGBTQ elders. And then just for folks' information, every week that we have these town halls, we gather lots of resources and information, and then we will post them in the resources section. There's a COVID-19 resources section and on our website. And so we will have all these resources if you're not seeing what you need in the text today. And just lots of great resources. So sort of shifting from elders, I want to talk a little bit about youth, because this is a place where we've done a lot of work. And so someone asked the question, what are the risks or warning signs to look for, especially with LGBTQ folks and suicide, and with LGBTQ youth? And I don't know if the warning signs are any different for the LGBTQ community. I doubt it, but I think folks are just wanting to, be good community partners, right? Like, watch out for their friends and family. So what are some of those risks and warning signs? And maybe I will start with Dior on this one.
Sure. I can speak from personal experience, but then also seeing how that has impacted others. I think this is particularly hard because usually it's one isolating themselves, but that's something that can't really be noticed nowadays because we're all isolating, so that's difficult. Being very depressed, irritable. Sometimes people use certain language, like saying goodbye to others, where it doesn't make much sense, giving things away that normally you would keep for yourself. Those are a few, but I think that a lot of times people won't outwardly tell you that they are planning to kill themselves. It's usually those unspoken words that people express that tell you that someone is trying to end their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Sivia, in your work with youth, have you seen any warning signs that are maybe more specific for younger folks?
Yeah, I know, like, there are definitely a lot of jokes around suicide right now, but, like, terminal, like, phrases or terminal thoughts where they're just like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore, or phrases like that that indicate that something might be a little off, or just, like, sudden changes in, like, behavior and mood, or, like, maybe they're, like, suddenly happy after a really, like, rough period of time, or just anything that could have been traumatizing that happened to them. And I would say, like, warning signs look different for everyone. So, like, one thing I've learned at YouthLine is always ask the question regardless, because it's always, like, better safe than sorry. And there's, like, no awkwardness really to asking, because the best answer you could hope for is, like, no, I'm not thinking of suicide. And if they do answer yes, then you can have, like, an actual conversation with them about planning around that.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think that when someone has completed suicide, often I know that it's hard for me to figure out how to best support their friends and family. Do you have any advice? And then I'll open it up for other folks too, because I know that's a big question.
Yeah, well, I think the best thing to do if a friend has opened up about that or has, like, recently suffered from a loss, like, is just to offer yourself up to listen, because talking really can help a lot. Like, even if you don't do anything, just being able to listen and support them and help them feel like their feelings are validated means a lot, especially, like, to youth like me, because sometimes we feel unheard by adults or just our families. And I think it's also important to remember, like, if you're supporting someone, you don't have to take all the responsibility of it. Like, it is definitely okay to reach out to YouthLine or like another trusted adult, like a counselor, and just find other help, because, like, as supportive as you can be, like, sometimes professional treatment or, like, adults can be, like, a long-term solution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I do want to ask other folks to chime in too, because I think that, you know, I'll just speak personally. Like, I had a friend last week who, her friend died by suicide, and she was really just like, why didn't I answer her last text? And really having a really hard time, feeling really bad because she didn't feel like she'd been a good enough friend. And I think that a lot of us you know, go through that when we've experienced that kind of loss in our life. Is there other advice folks can give? Maybe I see Annette raised her hand, and then I'll let Christian and chime in as well.
Well, one thing, Sivia is so right on. In terms of what you're saying, that just listening and being open. I just wanted to share a couple of things about responding after a suicide's happened in your community. One of the things I see us doing sometimes in our LGBTQ community is I think we really elevate and talk about some of the horrible things that happened, like trans people being murdered, people dying in our community. And it's not that we shouldn't talk about those things. It's very important. But it's also really important that we're sharing messages that talk about what's going well in our community and how we're supporting each other. And, you know, young people need to see those of us who are older and out and queer and living good lives, or even struggling and living good lives, which I think is actually the real deal about living, that we're doing that. So one piece around kind of talking with people, messaging after a suicide's happened is that we don't really want to share stories out about the specifics of how somebody killed themselves. That's actually, we found that can be really unhelpful, that people begin to can obsess on the method of someone dying, or even use it as kind of an inspiration for acting on their own. So keeping language simple around somebody has died by suicide, and not going into those details is important. And then the other piece is just what Sivia said, showing up in a really compassionate way, not being scared to use the word suicide, listen to the language that people are using and talking themselves about what's happened in their family. And one thing that I've had a number of folks who've lost people to suicide say to me is, people are scared to say the name of the person I lost to me. Well, I'm thinking of that person every day. If you're not bringing me pain by saying their name, you're like actually allowing me to talk about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And I think it's really important that we're more open, right, about talking about these things. And I'll share, a friend of mine lost her little brother to suicide, and every year one of her siblings has like an event in the park to commemorate him, and now he's turned it into a fundraiser to help suicide prevention. But I feel like it's just so important, that yearly remembrance, and having it be a big public event, inviting literally hundreds of people, because it's important to say his name, and it's important that we remember the people we loved, who we've lost. Christian, did you want to jump into around how we support people?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, echo everything everybody's already said. I guess with that too, in the disaster mental health world that I'm a part of, with the Disaster Distress Helpline, we have a saying that there's no timeline for recovery. And so it's a similar process for people who have experienced loss by suicide, or who are attempt survivors or been impacted in some way personally by suicide. To just have patience, and like I even said at the top of this forum for myself about validating the emotions that I'm going through, because it is a process. It can take weeks or months, and that's okay. If it starts to interfere with after weeks or months, if you feel like you're not moving forward, I think that's an opportunity for someone to reach out for other levels of support, whether it's through a crisis hotline or through other resources that are available in your community. But still, have patience and understanding that for people it's a process, and it's sort of a journey of moving forward on that path of recovery. There's not necessarily an end date to that. And so I think that we just need to give that kind of support, not just in the immediate aftermath, but weeks and months after. The other thing I'll say too is that I think we also express grief in so many ways, and especially in times like what we're experiencing now with physical distancing measures in place. A text can go a long way, just checking in with somebody. How are you today? An IM message, but also offering opportunities for people to express themselves non-verbally through art and music and poetry, and I think that's really important in the healing process as well. And then the final thing I'll say too is just that we do need, especially to what Dior is talking about here, is to offer culturally competent resources for people in the healing process, recovery process following suicide experiences. Because I know for me, as a gay man, for example, when my mother died, I wanted to talk to other gay people, other queer people who experience loss. I think there's something so powerful in just connecting with people who you feel like are going to have that extra level of understanding. In the disaster world too, it was something with the Disaster Distress Helpline that we're doing is a project called Strength After. We have a website, strengthafterdisaster.org, where it's really about survivors and responders speaking to other survivors and responders in recovery about what's helping them move forward on that path. Because there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of power in that kind of connection. And it's not just about the rose-colored, everything's great, this is what's working. It's also about the struggles and the challenges that people face in recovery. So I think that's something that certainly we can apply to people who've been touched by suicide as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's so important. And I think that I'd actually love to hear from Parker as well around this. And then I'll let Dior chime in too, because I feel like this is so much of what tonight is about is really how we support people in our community. So Parker, why don't you go ahead and jump in?
Thank you. I think that there are a couple of things around asking about suicide that are really intimidating. The first one is initiating the conversation in and of itself, and the second piece is what if the person says yes. I want to reiterate a little bit of what Sivia had mentioned as well, is that when people reach out for support or when people are talking about suicide, whether you're the person who started the conversation or not, it isn't your job to fix them or take away their mental health challenges or take away their suicidal ideation. You really are going to be the support person that's providing that person with the strength to save themselves. And that's where we give ourselves some compassion and take away some of the guilt that can come with, losing somebody to suicide. I've been there personally. I've had a friend that died by suicide, and I felt really guilty about what I could or couldn't have done. And navigating that can be really tricky for people. So understanding that it's okay to give yourself a little bit of grace when you have experienced that kind of trauma. But moving forward, if you want to educate yourself, there's so much training you can do. And outside of training, there's just natural human compassion and being able to recognize when somebody is struggling. And so one of the best things you can do for someone is ask that question, and to ask it really directly and openly and transparently. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? And not beating around the bush. The only reason that the conversation is uncomfortable is because our society has stigmatized it so much that we feel uncomfortable. And it's really only uncomfortable for the person asking the question, because when people are talking about suicide or somebody finally brings it up, there is just a sense of relief. I can tell you I can't even tell you how many times I've talked to somebody about it and they've gone, oh, I am, and thank you for asking me, or yes, I am, and nobody's ever asked me before. And so just giving that free range and that space can be so, so empowering to somebody who feels so out of control. The second piece is that you might not always be the right person to ask the question, and giving yourself that compassion is really important too. I think that sometimes it's going to be the wrong circumstances, or you're not going to be in the mental health space to do that for someone, or the person's going to be too close to you. And so if you can't ask the question or you feel uncomfortable, get someone else involved who can. And that's the Lifeline, that's YouthLine, that's, somebody, a teacher, a trusted adult, a counselor, somebody like that. And then that last piece around, if that person says yes, just treat it with non-judgment. If that person can stay safe and you don't have to call for EMS or a wellness check, sit with them, provide them that space. Know that you can just be a physical presence, and you can just listen to what's going on for them, and then you can get those supports in place, and maybe you handhold and you take them to a clinic, and you walk them there, or you get on the phone and call crisis line together, or you figure out a self-care plan around meeting with their provider or offering to go with them. But it's much more simpler than I think we think it is sometimes. It is really just coming back to those basic instincts of community and social understandings that this person's hurting, I'm hurting with them, I'm going to give them some empathy, and I'm going to give them some space, and I'm also going to help them navigate this really tough time. Because when we're in crisis, especially when we're thinking about suicide, our brains are shut down. Our brains are on fire. They're running all over the place. They don't know what to do. And so just having that grounding space with someone to ask and to guide and to navigate can be really helpful. And navigate doesn't mean solve. Navigate doesn't mean fix. It just means helping them manage what's going on for them. And so I think it's really, really important that we get comfortable with talking about it the way Annette said, this verbal dictionary that Annette gave us, and the different ways that we start to change the way we talk about suicide can help us ask that question. And really just kind of recognizing the baseline of the people in our lives, because the LGBTQ community is going to be disproportionately at risk no matter what. If that's a part of their story, then maybe we already know there's a risk factor involved. It doesn't mean that every queer person is thinking of suicide, and so getting that out of our head is also really important. So knowing that the way that we socially raise and misunderstand people in the LGBTQ plus community can impact the way that they think of themselves and the way that they navigate their mental health challenges. So if your friend is part of a community that's going to be disproportionately at risk, knowing that already can help us navigate the way we're going to ask them about suicide later on. Again, a long-winded conversation, but I think that it's important. Like, there's a lot of different advice coming from really amazing professionals in this conversation and outside of this. But there's never enough information to help us navigate the way that we talk about suicide and the way that we help others.
Thank you, Parker. And I wanted to ask Dior the same question, because I feel like sometimes it's hard to know how to support friends, especially in communities where there's still a lot of stigma in talking about suicide or mental health challenges.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times when people are asking for help, some people may not know how to support them in the best way. And so I think it's good for those who are offering to help them to ask them if they want to vent, if they want to be listened to, if they want advice, just to give them those options, because a lot of times people may not know exactly what they need help with. And a lot of times you hear a lot of the platitudes, and it's just not helpful when people might be dismissive of what you're going through. So if you don't want to hear those things and you just want to vent and you want to be heard, I think it's good to give people that space and the opportunity to decide how they want to be helped.
Yeah, thanks for that. It feels like there's a lot of unhelpful advice in the world, but not in this program. So yeah, I think that it's really important that we're figuring out how to really support each other. And so we had a question about how you all support volunteers and help them process challenges and difficult emotions. And so I think this one really is for folks in the crisis lines around, boundary setting and just like how you take care of, I guess in some ways it's like how you take care of yourselves when you're working with, when you're, listening to people in crisis all day. But Dior, if you have anything to say around this, since you, I'm sure, hear a lot of crisis stories, feel free to chime in.
So actually, I used to be a volunteer crisis counselor with Crisis Text Line for about a year or so, and that was a few years back. But I do remember them saying that it's okay to take some breaks between conversations or just take a break from the time that you are volunteering. I know for me, it became very triggering and overwhelming for me, so it was nice to know that that I didn't have to feel guilty for putting my self-care first. Also, knowing that, you can't fix everyone's problems, and yeah, I mean, those are the things that I remember when it comes to volunteering. So I am very grateful that there are parameters and protocol when it comes to making sure that volunteers are taking care of themselves, because if they don't, then they can't help others.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then, Christian, do you want to jump in about some of the protocols, I guess, around how volunteers can take care of themselves emotionally?
Sure. Well, at Vibrant, we have a curriculum that we use in New York City, but also for other organizations around the country called Staying in Balance. And it's really an approach of self-care that we promote to our crisis centers and our networks that talks about self-care at the individual level and what you can bring to it, because everybody has different ways. Some people like yoga, some people like listening to heavy metal music to relieve stress. But there's also an organizational responsibility of self-care, where whether it's nonprofits or corporations or governments, what have you, of creating a culture of self-care within your company that supports volunteers, paid staff at all levels, in all roles, across the board. I like to say that I feel like crisis centers are particularly good at this. Of course, Parker and Sivia can talk about their experiences, but it's something that you can't really rest on. There's always a need to address self-care, and that you have to adapt in times of disaster. And because certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, as many crisis centers, including volunteers, have transitioned to in-person services, to working remotely, it becomes all the more important to do that. And the other thing I'll just say about staying in balance and taking this look at self-care at the individual and company level, we also need to take a look at it at the macro level. And as crisis counselors, as volunteers, as workers in this movement, we have to advocate for living wages, for access to health care. Those are forms of self-care. And it's going to help us and empower us to cope in times like this. I mean, the work that Basic Rights Oregon is doing, the fight for equality, that's self-care. And it's a part of what's helping us to do our work. So wanted to get that in before the forum ends as a thank you to Basic Rights Oregon.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I mean, but I do feel like, while I appreciate the shout out, I also feel like you're bringing up this broader point, right? Of like, there's systemic issues that make people feel desperate in their lives. And so, I feel like at Basic Rights Oregon and a lot of organizations, we're trying to change the systems, right? To give people more equality, to give, living wages can save people's lives, right? If you feel like you can take care of your family, if you feel like you can do the things you need to do in your life. And I do think it's really important that we talk about these broader justice issues as suicide prevention in a lot of ways, because I feel like while depression affects everybody, I know that sometimes it's really just feeling hopeless about a situation, like, huge medical debt, etc., that feels really overwhelming. But going back to sort of the how you take care of yourself as a volunteer, I would be remiss if I didn't ask Sivia, our actual volunteer, about how you take care of yourself, especially as a youth, and how you see, how do you do that at YouthLine?
Well, in my room, especially, like, the people on my shift I'm very close to, and I'm, like, not afraid to reach out to them for help or support even when I'm in the middle of a conversation. And oftentimes, like, if a conversation is too hard for me, or I don't think I'm, like, the best person to support them, I can always talk to one of the lead volunteers or one of the supervisors to kind of take that over, or I find myself just like screaming out questions in the middle of the call room to kind of pick their brains. But having like two supervisors on the shift plus like a lead volunteer that knows what they're doing is really, really helpful, because the entire room is just ready to help you support that person, and it never feels like you're doing it alone. So I think that takes a lot of the pressure off from me. And as for, like, self-care, like, in the beginning of this crisis, all of the YouthLine staff, some of the YouthLine staff, like, reached out to me personally and, like, was, like, checking in on how I was doing, and I really, really appreciated that. So it's just a really welcoming community, and they always, like, check in on you and take care of you.
That's good to hear. But I do think we only have a few minutes left, and maybe I will do a round of how people are I'm coming up with a question as I say it, but I think that there is something really specific about this time and around how we support our community and their mental health. when we can't do the things that we normally do, like hug them really hard, or like say, come over, sit on my couch, or I'm going to come over and sit with you until you feel better, or until we ate all the ice cream, or whatever it is that you normally do to support your friends. And so maybe I will just start at the top with top of the alphabet with Annette, and you can also, Annette, I wanted to ask you, if I was a community organization that wanted support around reaching out to the LGBTQ community around suicide prevention, is there an opportunity you can tell me about?
Well, Nancy, how wonderful of you to ask. You all might know this a little staged. I do want to announce here that it looks like there's going to be an opportunity for Oregon organizations that want to do support, particularly LGBTQ organizations, to receive mini grants from the Oregon Health Authority of up to $10,000, or if it's two organizations coming together, it could be $20,000. To do specifically LGBTQ support in the COVID-19 environment. We will be administering that through the Alliance. There'll be more details to come, and Basic Rights Oregon is going to be definitely one of the places that's helping to publicize this. But I think it's a real recognition that our community needs this extra support, and for the first time actually some small resources, but it could be really significant for a local effort connected with that. So that's the answer to that first question, Nancy. And then I think the second one is what are we doing for each other and how to support each other. And I just want to draw on the wisdom of queer folks. You know, we got through, we lost many people, but we have navigated the AIDS epidemic and HIV. We have people who are in poly community who have thought really carefully about creating circles of safety with one another. I want us to think about how we are creating our pods who have some agreements and are thoughtful about exposure, and then take the time to do the Zoom calls. I mean, I get Zoom fatigue like everyone else does, but I also really get charged up by that. And my other thing is, let's just like totally go for it with the silliness. Like if you have an impulse to be silly, I say bring it on, because I think that there's so much heavy right now that we have to lean into the ridiculous.
Lean into the ridiculous. Great advice. But I really appreciate it. I think it is, things are really heavy. And even, tonight I was just like, can I wear glittery eyeshadow? We're going to be talking about suicide. But I think it's important that we take moments of levity and really be ourselves. And also, it's 7:25, so I have to announce the winner of the raffle of the Protect Trans Kids tote bag, and that is the one and only Serenity Ebert, frequent bro volunteer, and we will be sending that tote bag to you. Thanks for watching tonight, and I'm going to move on to Christian, if you want to tell us in a minute or so about how you're supporting your community.
I think it's amazing what Annette said, just about drawing on the inherent resilience of the queer community. I do want to mention in my 1 minute that a shout out to the Trevor Project, which is dedicated to supporting queer youth and young adults, as well as the Trans Lifeline, which is a crisis line staffed by and for trans folks in our community. And, I think that like everybody's saying, we have to get creative, but still practice distancing, because it is really important. We all have an urge to get out into our communities and meet up with people at restaurants or bars or wherever that we normally do. And it's so important for us in whatever community you live in to still practice the distancing measures. But within that, I think it's what everybody else is saying. Just continue to be your fabulous selves, but via text or IM or a Zoom call or, whatever it is, just stay connected. because none of us are ever truly alone. There's always a voice out there somewhere, whether it's a crisis line or a friend that you haven't talked to in a while. It might be a chance for you to reach out to them.
Thank you, Christian. Dior?
I think trying to take care of myself is, I think, a way that I'm supporting my community, because as a result, I can work to have conversations with them, share resources, like the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, also Violet, which is queer competent mental health care. So just being a space for them to talk about what they're going through, also having these conversations online can also be very helpful. It's also nice to just tune in and hear what people are talking about, because it can be very lonely during this time. So just trying to support my community in any way that I can.
Thank you. And yeah, self-care is such an important part of community care. And, you know, you have to put that oxygen mask on first, right? But really basic advice that I have to remind myself of all the time. Parker?
I think that I come from a lot of privilege. It's not I think, it's a pretty valid statement. I'm a cis female and I'm white. So I think that it's a shout out to anyone who considers themselves an ally, because allyship is not a self-proclaimed title. You have to earn it. And part of that is activism and standing up and making space and shutting up when queer people are given that opportunity. But I think that one thing we can do during COVID to really help our LGBTQ plus community, friends and family and neighbors and members of our community, is actually checking in on them and doubling up those efforts. I think it is our responsibility to take care of each other, and really making sure that we take the extra effort to do that. Obviously, if we're in a mentally well space. And speaking of mentally well, I think that it's also something I'm doing right now, especially working in so much crisis and also supporting so many youth volunteers and supporting my staff and supporting myself and my family, is putting up boundaries when I need to, and saying that I'm at capacity, or I can't do this right now, or I can support you later, or I know this person or this thing is a resource. So really giving myself the permission to say no when I need to has been really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important advice all the time, not just during the pandemic. And Sivia, do you have any closing thoughts on how you support your friends and community?
Well, mostly just checking in on everyone and sending even a good morning text to make sure they know that you're still thinking of them and you're still a support system if they want to talk about anything. And for people part of the LGBTQ plus community, especially, I have a couple friends that are really struggling to stay isolated within their families because their parents aren't the most accepting. And just sitting with them and validating how they're feeling, and kind of just listening to their problems around that is really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Last week we had a whole show on supporting LGBTQ youth in particular, and so many folks don't have their normal support system. So thank you for being a friend to folks who are feeling that. Well, it is 7:31, so I've slightly gone over our time, but I just wanted to give a big thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the work you do. And we will be meeting up again for Queer Town Hall next week. We'll be talking to some queer artists about creating art during this time, and there'll be some live performances. Pretty exciting. So tune in next week for Queer Town Hall, and have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Everyone at Basic Rights.
Thanks.
Thank you.